You find yourself crouched behind heavy silk curtains inside the Forbidden City, the very heart of Imperial China. The marble floor is cold beneath your knees, and the faintest whisper of fabric rustles in the still night. 16 palace women move like silent phantoms through the emperor's chamber. Their bare feet make no sound, but their eyes are filled with a desperate fire. One girl, no older than 14, trembles as she loops a curtain cord around the neck of the sleeping emperor. Her hands shake, not because she doubts the plan, but because she knows the stakes. In this world, there is no middle ground, either freedom or death. For women inside the imperial harem, life was not life at all. It was captivity disguised with silk and gold. The ribbon pulls tight, but the knot slips. The emperor stirs, choking, gasping, and in that moment the plot begins to collapse. Panic fills the room. The women know what will follow. In the Ming Dynasty courts, failure did not mean mercy. It meant torture, slow, deliberate, and meant to serve as a warning to others. Yet, for this single night, these women dared to resist a system that treated them as nothing more than livestock bred for an emperor's pursuit of immortality. They were not assassins by training. They were concubines, musicians, readers of poetry, and daughters torn from their families. But the cruelty of their daily existence had driven them to this moment, when even certain death seemed preferable to another day of degradation. Imagine stepping inside the Forbidden City as a girl of 14. You have never traveled more than a few miles from your village. You have never seen buildings that scrape the sky or walls painted with dragons and phoenixes that seem to follow your every movement. The air smells foreign, incense heavy with smoke, mixed with the sharp, metallic tang of authority. You hear whispers in dialects you do not know. Somewhere, muffled crying echoes through the halls. For over 2 millennia, from the Qin dynasty in 221 before Christ to the fall of the Qing in 1912 after Christ, Chinese emperors built harems that sometimes housed 20,000 women at once. These harems were not places of romance, but cages of control, politics, and suffering. The selection process was merciless. Every 3 years, officials combed through the empire, seeking girls between 14 and 16 years old. Beauty was not the only qualification. Lineage, character, health, and obedience were equally important. Once chosen, a girl's life as she knew it ended. She disappeared into the palace, never again to see her parents, siblings, or the familiar earth of her village. Inside the palace walls, the hierarchy was unyielding. At the very top stood the empress, the emperor's sole official wife, and the figurehead for all the women below her. She was revered as the mother of the world, yet even her power existed at the mercy of her husband. Beneath her stretched a carefully ranked order of consorts, concubines, and attendants. A single wrong glance, a careless word, could destroy a woman's standing. The architecture itself was a prison disguised as majesty. The inner court was designed for containment, ensuring no woman could escape the emperor's reach. Guards patrolled every gate. Eunuchs, men castrated to ensure loyalty and prevent competition, watched every movement. They wielded terrifying power, often deciding which women thrived and which vanished into obscurity. Picture the life of one such eunuch. Perhaps he was 8 years old when he was dragged from his family and held down as a blade stripped him of manhood forever. Survival rates were less than 60%. Those who lived endured lifetimes of pain, humiliation, and ostracism. Neither fully male nor female, they belonged nowhere except in service to the palace, yet they became indispensable cogs in the machinery of imperial control. The harem was not simply about women waiting for the emperor's attention. It was an entire bureaucratic system. Records of intimacy were meticulously logged. Before a concubine could share the emperor's bed, she was examined by court physicians and bathed under supervision. Even the most private moments were catalogued in ink, transforming intimacy into an entry in an imperial ledger. For these women, daily life was not measured by joy or choice, but by surveillance and subjugation. The emperor's favor could elevate a girl to near divine status. His neglect could condemn her to decades of invisibility. And yet, beneath the silks and rituals, there was only fear, a fear so suffocating that 16 women once dared to strangle their sovereign in hopes of reclaiming a shred of humanity. The journey into the harem began long before the palace gates closed behind these young girls. In their villages, the announcement of the imperial selection was both an honor and a death sentence. Officials arrived with scrolls and lists, calling out names as families bowed in trembling silence. Parents wept quietly, torn between pride that their daughter was chosen and grief that they would likely never see her again. Imagine a mother clutching her 14-year-old daughter's hand as soldiers take her away. The girl has never known hunger, never felt danger, but now she is bound for a palace where survival depends not on strength or wit alone, but on navigating a labyrinth of fear and politics. The mother whispers blessings, promising that the ancestors will protect her child, even as she knows those words are hollow. The gates of the Forbidden City do not open for return. Inside the palace, the nightmare deepened. Many of these girls had already endured footbending, a practice that began when they were as young as 4 years old. Their bones were broken deliberately, the arch bent until it folded upon itself, the toes rotting and sometimes falling away. Mothers, themselves victims of the same cruelty, bound their daughters' feet tighter with each passing week, believing it ensured a better future. Picture a little girl crying out as her mother wraps blood-soaked cloth around her tiny feet. The smell of infection fills the air, but no one stops. This was not simply a beauty standard, it was a method of control. Bound feet crippled women, making them dependent on others for movement. For those inside the harem, it meant absolute imprisonment. Even if they dared escape the palace, their mutilated feet could not carry them beyond the walls. When the emperor summoned a concubine, her broken body was carried into his chamber, sometimes naked, unable even to walk. To many outsiders, the harem seemed a place of privilege, but for the women inside, it was a gilded prison where love was replaced with pain and obedience. The emperor's obsessions made matters worse. During the reign of the notorious Jiajing emperor, spelled out as Jia Jing, who ruled from 1521 to 1567, horror reached new depths. Obsessed with achieving immortality, he believed the menstrual blood of virgins could create a red elixir known as red lead. To him, these young girls were not human beings, they were ingredients. He ordered that 13-year-old virgins be collected and fed nothing but mulberry leaves and rainwater, believing this diet kept their blood pure. Rows of young girls were locked in chambers, their bodies withering from malnutrition, their every cycle recorded, harvested, and stored. Guards monitored their physical changes, waiting for the moment puberty arrived so their blood could be taken. Imagine the terror of a girl barely old enough to play with dolls, examined monthly by eunuchs, her blood taken like she was livestock. Those who produced the most were given slightly better food. Those who did not were beaten or discarded. Over time, the emperor even lowered the age, bringing in children as young as 8 years old, little more than babies, whose only crime was being born female in an empire where their bodies were seen as vessels for a man's delusions. The emperor himself withdrew from governance, retreating deeper into isolation. While the people of his empire starved and foreign powers threatened the borders, he focused entirely on his grotesque experiments. The palace became a laboratory of suffering. The women, watching one another wither, began whispering of escape. Hope was rare, but desperation often breeds courage. And so, in the shadows of incense-choked halls, 16 women began to plan something unthinkable, the assassination of their emperor. They were not warriors. They were daughters, sisters, and unwilling brides, but they had seen enough to know that continuing life in the harem was nothing more than death stretched out over years. Better to risk a quick end by the blade than to remain prisoners in a palace that bled them dry. The night of the plot arrived like any other. The emperor had spent the evening in the chamber of his favored concubine, Lady Duan, before retiring alone. 16 women, hidden among the silks and shadows, prepared to act. They had rehearsed for weeks, whispering their plans through coded language, practicing knots in secret, and memorizing their roles. One would hold down the emperor's arms, another his legs, while the youngest was tasked with pulling the strangling cord. Picture that scene, the faint glow of oil lamps flickering against carved wooden beams, the muffled sound of the palace settling for the night. The emperor lies on his bed, wrapped in heavy brocade. Suddenly, the curtains part and hands seize him from all sides. His eyes open in shock as he struggles, but the women hold firm. One girl removes the silk ribbon from her hair, perhaps the last gift from her mother before she was taken, and loops it around his throat. She pulls with all her strength. Another woman tightens a curtain cord over it. But fate is cruel. The knot slips, the angle is wrong, and the emperor begins to stir violently. The women panic. Some freeze in terror. Others cry silently as they realize their failure. For a moment, history teeters on the edge. Had they succeeded, the emperor's reign might have ended that night, and their names might have lived on as martyrs of freedom. But inexperience betrayed them. They were women trained in poetry and music, not killers. One of the conspirators, overcome with fear, fled and betrayed them to Empress Fang. The emperor, unconscious until the next day, was spared. When he awoke, rage filled the palace like fire. The punishment was swift, merciless, and calculated to destroy not only the women but their families as well. The 16 women were condemned to the most brutal of deaths, lynching, known as death by 1,000 cuts. This was not execution. It was torture elevated to an art of cruelty. Condemned were tied to wooden frames, and skilled executioners began with small incisions on the arms and legs. Over hours, sometimes days, they peeled away flesh slice by slice, keeping the victims alive as long as possible. Records speak of as many as 3,000 cuts. Picture those women on the execution ground. Some prayed, others screamed until their voices broke. The youngest, perhaps only 15, stood silent, too terrified even to cry. She had never known life outside the palace walls. She had never seen the world beyond red gates and golden roofs. Now she was forced to face an end too horrific for words, but the punishment did not end with them. 10 of their family members were beheaded. 20 others were enslaved. Parents who had already lost their daughters to imperial selection now lost their lives as well. Siblings were sold into servitude. Generations of entire families were erased, all because 16 young women dared to challenge an emperor who harvested their blood for his immortality rituals. And the emperor's response? It was not reflection or remorse. Instead, he tightened restrictions further. He withdrew deeper into his chambers, and after Empress Fang's death, brought in hundreds more girls to replenish his harem. The system of cruelty did not weaken. It grew stronger, feeding on the courage and sacrifice of those who had tried to resist it. The Renayan plot, as history remembers it, was not just an assassination attempt. It was a cry of desperation, the moment when suffering became unbearable. It reminds us that sometimes even failure speaks louder than silence. Centuries after the Renayan plot, the palace walls still held their secrets, and the harem continued its quiet cycle of suffering. By the late Qing dynasty, the Forbidden City remained both magnificent and merciless. It was in this world that a young woman named Consort Zhen entered history. Born in 1876, she was chosen alongside her elder sister to join the harem of Emperor Guangxu. She was only 13 when she first crossed the Vermilion Gates, a child swallowed by the machinery of power. Yet unlike many concubines who disappeared into obscurity, Consort Zhen captured the emperor's heart. She was vibrant, curious, and unafraid to ask questions. In a palace where women were expected to be silent ornaments, she showed an unusual independence of mind. She read foreign newspapers, studied Western inventions, and encouraged the emperor to embrace reforms. Her energy was like sunlight in a world built of shadows, and Emperor Guangxu, weary of tradition, found in her a rare partner. But love in the Forbidden City was as dangerous as neglect. Be favored by the emperor meant drawing the jealousy of those who craved control, none more so than Empress Dowager Cixi. Cixi had risen from a low-ranking concubine to the most powerful woman in China. She had survived by mastering ruthlessness, by ensuring no rival threatened her grasp. To her, Consort Zhen was not merely a concubine. She was a threat. Young, intelligent, beloved by the emperor, and outspoken about reform, everything Cixi despised. At first, she punished her through humiliation. Consort Zhen was degraded, accused of meddling in politics, and even flogged. Imagine being 24 years old, stripped and beaten by eunuchs under the order of another woman, all because you dared to speak of progress. The palace whispered, but no one intervened. To challenge Cixi was to sign your own death warrant, Yet Zhen remained resilient. She continued to encourage Guangxu in his reformist ambitions, whispering ideas of modernization at a time when China staggered under internal strife and foreign pressure. Her courage only deepened the Empress Dowager's fury. In 1900, chaos erupted with the Boxer Rebellion. Foreign armies marched into Beijing, and the imperial court fled in fear. Before leaving, Cixi summoned consort Zhen. She spoke with feigned concern, saying, "You are too young and too beautiful. If foreign soldiers see you on the road, they will surely defile you. You know what you must do." It was a sentence cloaked as mercy. Cixi was ordering her to take her own life, but consort Zhen refused. Instead, she begged that Emperor Guangxu be allowed to remain in the capital to negotiate peace. Even at the edge of her own destruction, she thought not of herself, but of her country and her emperor. That defiance sealed her fate. Furious, Cixi ordered that consort Zhen be thrown into a narrow well behind the Ningrong Palace. Picture that final moment. A young woman of 24, struggling as soldiers dragged her toward the stone circle. She looked down into the darkness, a shaft 20 or 30 feet deep, filled with stagnant water. The rough stones scraped her hands as she was forced over the edge. Her final glimpse of the sky was brief, then swallowed by blackness. Whether she broke her bones in the fall or drowned slowly in icy water, her death was terror without mercy. Today, tourists in the Forbidden City still pause at that well. They peer into its shadowy depths, snapping photographs, murmuring about a tragic love story. But few imagine the true horror. The cries silenced in darkness, the lungs filling with water, the knowledge that her death was not fate, but the decision of another woman who had learned cruelty too well. Consort Zhen's story reveals both the fragility and the strength of women in the palace. She had little power, yet she dared to speak, to love, to hope for reform. Her courage, though crushed, endures as one of the most haunting echoes within the Forbidden City. The Forbidden City was more than a palace. It was a machine of control that consumed women and reshaped them. Some, like Empress Dowager Cixi, began as powerless concubines but rose to dominate the empire. Chosen at a young age, Cixi bore the emperor's only surviving son in 1856, and by 1861 she seized power through a daring coup. For nearly half a century, she ruled from behind the throne, mastering the cruelty that once bound her. Instead of reforming the system, she enforced it with ruthless efficiency. She spied on her son, stifled his freedom, and destroyed rivals without hesitation. When her foster son, Emperor Guangxu, leaned toward reform under consort Zhen's influence, Cixi viewed the young concubine as a threat. In 1900, she ordered Zhen's death in the infamous well, an act that revealed how the system's victims often became its fiercest defenders. This was the true horror of the harem. It did not simply imprison women, it taught them to perpetuate oppression. Friendships were dangerous, alliances fragile, and love nearly impossible. Survival often meant cruelty, and power was maintained through fear. Yet even in such darkness, sparks of courage remained. 16 women once dared to strangle an emperor, choosing certain death over continued torment. Centuries later, consort Zhen defied Cixi, pleading for reform even as she faced execution. Their bravery, though silenced, echoes across time. Today, tourists walk the red walls and golden courtyards, admiring the beauty of the Forbidden City. Few pause to remember the countless women whose lives were consumed within those walls. Their suffering should not be romanticized as palace intrigue, but honored as testimony, proof that even in the harshest cages, the human spirit still sought dignity, freedom, and truth.